All right, you guys, so as you can see by the thumbnail, I got another one like the other one. So check it out. I'm going to get straight into this one. I got a couple stories I want to try to get out to you guys. I'm way behind. I took a couple days off, like I said, in my inner demons to catch up on my taxes, to take care of some medical stuff, and to take care of some personal stuff around the house. So without further ado, let me get straight into this story. So this story right here is another short story about an individual by the name of Francisco Villa, who went by Shady from VNE. His neighborhood, VNE, Barrio Nuevo Estrada, is a neighborhood that you guys have heard me talk a lot about before in the past. VNE is also another one of those long-standing gangs in Southern California that has a well-established history for being deeply rooted within the Mexican Mafia's internal workings. I'm sure that all Mexican Mafia members that have been inducted within that organization still maintain contact and strong ties to their neighborhoods, as these are their origins, their initial beginnings. This is where they came from. But the fact remains that there's just some Mexican Mafia members that have maintained a stronger and more consistent relationship with these street gangs by proactively continuing to be involved in their day-to-day politics and by continuing to assert their influence and control over them. You know, this is something that I talked about in one of my previous stories where I used Tablas and Babo from Florencia as examples. Tablas has always continued to assert some level of control over Florencia. And then his older brother, before he passed, Babo, was also the same way. In fact, Tablas' involvement was so extensive that he also implemented street policies for Florencianos to operate under that were all derived from interrelated Mexican Mafia concepts. For those of you that follow my content, again, you guys probably remember me talking about a lot of this stuff when I ran that story on how Florencia got hit with that federal superseding indictment and Tablas was an unindicted co-conspirator. Like I said in that other story, it was during the course of executing a search warrant that law enforcement intercepted a copy of those policies, who allegedly found them taped underneath an end table that was owned by a Florencia 13 gang member. And that's how law enforcement was able to discover how extensive Tablas' grip was on Florencia, as well as how close this street gang worked parallel with the Mexican Mafia. Joker, Danny Boy, and Cricket are three Mexican Mafia members that have continued to maintain a strong level of influence and control over their neighborhood, Big Hazard, as well. And these collaborative relationships are mutually beneficial. So Joker, Danny Boy, and Cricket reap the financial benefits by ensuring that Big Hazard stays on course with the Mexican Mafia's taxation program, and they also get the credit and recognition for tapping into these resources for the organization as a whole. And on the flip side, Big Hazard continues to maintain three strong voices within the MA that ensures that their best interest is always at the forefront, and that Big Hazard continues to be recognized as an honorable street gang that is not only respected, but who is also fully backed by the Mexican Mafia as well. So with respects to Florencia, Tablas had even defined what some of this entails to his neighborhood in one of his general filters to the gang members on the streets. Another kite that was also intercepted in that same search. In this particular kite, Tablas had basically summarized that him and Babo had went out of their way to ensure that Florencia was never taken advantage of insofar as taxing, as well as to make sure that they were never placed on a green light list as a result of a frivolous claim or behind nefarious politicking. I'm sure that Joker, Danny Boy, and Cricket also did the same thing for Big Hazard. So aside from Florencia and Big Hazard, you also had Pee-wee and Psycho from the Avenues, Popeye from Harpies, Night Owl and Puppet from 18th Street, and then you had two others who were probably more relevant to this story before they passed, Chewy and Smokey from VNE. You know, I could probably go on and on naming other Mexican Mafia members that have continued to represent their neighborhoods as well, but believe it or not, there's probably more who don't. Because once they were inducted within the Mexican Mafia, their mindset now begins to focus on other things, such as organized crime and generating money. At least that's how it was for a lot of NF members. The mentality was, we're no longer gang members. We don't think about gang banging. We're now into things like organized crime, generating money, legitimate businesses, things like that. However, I think the one thing that they all continue to have in common is that they never forget their roots, where they came from. That's something that continues to remain important. At least from my experience, like I said, the mentality has always been to get away from the gangbang mentality. and to begin expanding your mind into the world of organized crime, investing in legitimate businesses, and fine-tuning leadership qualities. So anyways, this story starts out sometime around 2002, and it starts with a common misconception that most, if not all, gangs fight about: territory. Whether it's a street corner, an apartment complex, a city block, or a section in the neighborhood. These are all places and things that they fight and kill each other over. But in all actuality, these are pieces of real estate that neither one of them will ever own. And the same thing applies to prison. Whether it's a mainline yard, an ad seg yard, an entire prison, a table, a phone, a shower, a bench, a handball court, or any other theoretical piece of real estate. Gangs are willing to die and kill each other over these things behind the walls as well. And whether they win or lose, it makes no difference. The point is that they never own these things. They never have, and they never will. So this story is a good example of not only that, but also some of the detriments and fallout that this misconception creates. So there's a park in Los Angeles on East Olympic Boulevard called the Lou Costello Recreation Center. So this particular park is in the heart of East LA, in an area that both VNE and ESG, the 8th Street gang, claim to be their territory. In fact, they both claim this park as belonging to them and the surrounding areas as being their territory. So from everything I've been able to gather, VNE and ESG are two gangs that have been involved in a deadly turf war over this territory for years. So again, this story starts out sometime in or around November of 2002 when an individual by the name of Martin Gonzalez was at the Lou Costello Recreation Park drinking a beer with another individual named Lethal from VNE. So supposedly Martin Gonzalez wasn't affiliated with gangs. He was considered to be someone that's known as a resident, somebody that's from Southern California, but who doesn't necessarily identify with being from a particular gang. Lethal, on the other hand, was a known VNE gang member. He was somebody that was supposedly involved in several of the past conflicts between VNE and ESG. According to my source, he was a little rider, and he was known to be one of the main instigators of this conflict. So at the end of the day, what I'm about to tell you guys is like one of the unwritten rules within the gang subculture. And that is this: if you're out there kicking it with someone that's a known gang member and they run into one of their rivals, it doesn't matter if you claim to be affiliated or not. That becomes insignificant. It doesn't matter if you gangbang or not, because in that scenario, you might as well be from a neighborhood, because that's how you're going to be looked at. You're guilty by association, and if you're kicking it with someone that they consider to be one of their rivals, they're going to label you as the same thing. That's just how it works. At the end of the day, this is one of the consequences, one of the unforeseen consequences that comes with being in the presence of a known gang member. If they got conflict, you got conflict, and that's just the way that it works. If they run into their ops, then you're gonna have issues as well. So as Lethal and this guy Martin were sitting on one of the park's benches drinking 40 ounces of Mickey's malt liquor, a guy wearing a hoodie and one of those COVID masks that everybody used to wear that covered your face ran by shooting at them, yelling out ESG. And keep in mind, even though this park was an area that both of these sets claimed to be their territory, it was ground zero. So Lethal was packing as well. So as soon as this guy started shooting, Lethal pulled out a 9mm Beretta that he had in his waistband and started shooting back at him as well. And this guy ran right up on him. He was pretty close when he started shooting. So they're lucky that both of them didn't end up getting laid out. So when the smoke cleared, Lethal, he didn't get hit. But Martin, on the other hand, took a non-lethal round to his ass. So he had to be taken to the hospital. Apparently, as soon as the shooting happened, someone called 911. So the fire department and the paramedics were literally there within minutes. And this was something that Lethal obviously anticipated himself, because as soon as he found out that Martin was hit, he hid his gun in some nearby bushes and waited for the paramedics to get there. But here's the crazy thing about this story that I tripped on when I first heard it. After Martin went to the hospital and got patched up, 2 days later, he went back to the park looking for blood. But this time, he took 2 other VNE gang members with him, Shady and another individual who they called Wicked. Shady was a gang member from VNE who was on the fast track of making a name for himself because of all the work he was putting in on the streets. Supposedly, he had been involved in several other shootings that had taken place throughout the Ramona Gardens and some of the surrounding areas. And according to my source, it seemed like the more shootings he was involved in, the more confident he became. Or like they say, once you spill blood that first time, it becomes easier for you from that point on. And apparently he was described by some of his own homeboys as being trigger happy and someone that was intoxicated with the smell of gunpowder. So coincidentally, Shady just so happened to be another VNE gang member that Martin knew. And once Shady found out what had happened at Lou Costello Park, he didn't need any encouragement when it came to running it back against ESG for what happened in the park. As far as Shady was concerned, ESG had kicked it off and they had drew first blood, literally. So aside from hearing about what had happened from his homeboy Lethal, when Martin told Shady about the details of the shooting, this only infuriated him more. So like I said, Martin was considered to be what's known as a resident, someone who really wasn't involved in gangbanging. But this didn't mean that Martin wasn't willing to be involved in paying ESG back for shooting him in the ass. Anyways, 2 days after the initial shooting, Martin, Shady, and Wicked went back to the park for the sole purpose of trying to find an ESG member slipping. So on the day that this incident took place, Wicked picked up Shady in his 1996 Impala. And then they drove a short distance down the street and picked up Martin, who also lived in the Estrada course. So remember this detail right here because it becomes significant later on in the story. But I guess when Wicked and Shady pulled up to Martin's to pick him up, Martin gets in the car and Wicked apparently offered to let him use a handgun, another handgun that he had, and Martin declined. That should have sent up a red flag right there, but neither one of them caught it or they just didn't care. I don't know why this didn't send up a red flag. Maybe this guy was related to one of them or he was related to someone else. I only know what I know. But later on, they would both end up regretting this. So when they pull up to the park and they get out of the car, Shady had a guitar case that he was carrying an AK-47 in. And Wicked was carrying a semi-automatic handgun that he had tucked in his waistband. You know, I don't know how these guys looked, but it was broad daylight, and these guys being gang members, Shady holding a guitar case, they had to have looked suspicious. But anyways, they walk through the park and they make their way back over to the bench, the same spot where Martin and Lethal were drinking their beer when that ESG gang member ran by shooting at him. You know, in some sense, I guess in Shady's mind, this was symbolic of them dropping their flag and taking over an area of the park where VNE had previously been challenged. Again, you guys, this is all predicated on territory and the right to claim territory that neither one of these two gangs will ever own. The park is owned and paid for by the city of Los Angeles. They own the park. It's the government's property. But in their fog of disillusioned gangbang mentality, they don't see it that way, and they're still willing to fight and kill for it. You know, I can't stand here and be too critical about this because before I had the ability to see it for what it really is, I used to do the same thing. We used to think that we owned the corner of 24th and Mission, and we were willing to fight for those streets, but none of it ever belonged to us. Anyways, when these three got to the park, it was around 5 p.m. in the evening, so it was just starting to get dark, but there was still plenty of sunlight. In fact, they were still practically in broad daylight. You could still see the full length of the park and the apartment complex that was directly across the street. So at one point, Shady asked Martin to look in the direction of the apartment complex, where a crowd had gathered in a carport directly between two buildings. Some of the people in this crowd appeared to be drinking beer and others were just standing around socializing, just out there enjoying the Southern California sunshine, completely oblivious of the danger that was happening directly across the street from them in the park. So as Martin was scanning the crowd to see if he recognized anyone or if anyone looked similar to the individual that had just shot at him, Shady opened up the guitar case and pulled out the AK-47. Wicked took this as a cue to get ready and pulled out the semi-automatic handgun that he had tucked in his waistband. Honestly, it wouldn't have mattered what Martin said at that point. He could have said that he recognized someone or that he didn't recognize anyone over there at all. It wouldn't have mattered what he said either way. The results would have been the same. When gang members get that kind of energy and they start feeding off of each other, there's not much that you can do to diffuse the situation from that point on. You know, it's the same concept when you have a couple gang members that are driving around looking for ops, and when they think they spot a rival, they level up to the point of confronting this individual. Once it escalates to that point, it's usually beyond the point of no return. What I mean by that is this: if they jam someone up, they ask him where he's from, Usually, it doesn't matter what he says. He's gonna get jumped on. Either way. He can either rep his hood or he can say he don't gangbang. There's not a right or a wrong answer. But at that point, it doesn't matter because these individuals are already of the mindset of smashing this guy. Maybe it's different for different people, but at least that's how it was for me and my homies when I was younger. When we used to gangbang out there in Frisco, when we take it to the point of jamming someone up and asking them where they were from, it didn't matter what they said. Once we got out the car or once we confronted them, they were getting mollywopped either way. It didn't matter what they said. So later on, when all this would come out, when this case would end up in court, it was said that Martin either answered in the negative, that he didn't recognize someone, or he just didn't answer at all. But either way, at that point, Shady pointed the AK-47 in the direction of the crowd and started firing. Wicked followed suit and began firing his semi-automatic handgun into the crowd at around the same time. So when the bullets started flying in the direction of the apartment complex, there was an uninvolved individual by the name of Manuel Palacios directly across the street in the general area unloading his family's groceries. Manuel wasn't from ESG. In fact, he wasn't even a gang member. He was what one would consider to be a Mexican national, a paisa, or a border brother. And apparently, he had just returned home from the grocery store with a trunk load full of groceries. So when Manuel got home and he just finished parking his car in his carport, his wife and his 2 young sons came running out to help him unload the groceries. And you guys know how it is. Usually, this is a happy time for the kids to unload groceries. Who isn't happy when there's a whole trunk load of groceries coming into the house? Because not only is all the food in the house going to be replenished, but I'm sure there was also a lot of goodies and things that they liked and things they were waiting for as well. I remember when my parents used to bring home the groceries. I get all excited. I go out to help them carry everything back in. But as I was carrying these bags in, I'd be looking in the bags to see what kind of treats and goodies they bought for me. So usually this is a happy time for the kids when mom or dad bring home the groceries. So like I said, Manuel had literally just parked and had begun to unload his groceries as his wife and 2 sons witnessed him being struck and killed by one of Shady's bullets from his AK-47. So after firing 2 bursts of gunfire into the crowd, Shady, Martin, and Wicked ran back to Wicked's Impala, threw the guns in the trunk, and then drove back to the Estrada Courts housing projects to talk about what they had just done. And Shady was well aware of the fact that he had hit someone because even though he was across the street in the park, he seen Manuel fall face down onto the sidewalk after being struck by one of his bullets. In fact, during the short ride back to the Ramona Gardens, Shady kept bragging about the guy he hit that fell face down on the sidewalk and how he didn't move after he hit the ground. So when they got back to the projects, they all went to Shady's spot. And when they got there, they made a pact amongst each other to never repeat what had happened to anyone else or to ever talk about it ever again. And that if any one of them broke that pact, that they would agree that their mother was to be taken out. That whoever broke that pact, their mother would pay the ultimate price. After that, Wicked and Martin, they both left and then they called it a night. But after they left, Shady couldn't stop stressing or thinking about what had happened that day. He couldn't stop thinking about how he left himself exposed to Martin because Martin didn't have a weapon. He felt like he didn't have to worry about Wicked because Wicked had blood on his hands as well. But Martin, on the other hand, there was nothing stopping him from going to the cops. And that's what bothered him. Again, this is something that he should have thought about when Wicked offered to let Martin use that other handgun. But obviously, they were so turned up at that time that they didn't trip on it. And unfortunately for them, this would end up being a bad mistake. You know, who knows what Martin might have been thinking. Maybe his religious beliefs or the weight of guilt might have eventually pushed him to go to the police later. But Shady should have thought about that earlier. It was too late for that now. You know, you just never know what someone's going to do. I myself have even learned that just when you think you know someone, that's when they end up turning on you. And most of the time when it happens, it's unprovoked for no reason, out of nowhere. So it's a tough position to be in. So after a long sleepless night, the following day, Shady went to Martin's apartment and he asked him straight up. He's like, hey bro, are you going to tell him? I need to know, like, Do I need to worry about it? Is anything gonna happen? Am I good? Are we good? And Martin apparently told him no. He's like, I'm not gonna say nothing, bro. He's like, I got no reason to say anything. You went to the park to back me up, and what happened happened. That's our secret. It's our pact. We're good. But why would Martin say anything else but no? Seriously, I think Shady just needed that validation, and he got it. But whether or not he could believe it was another thing. At the end of the day, Shady took him for his word on it. He had no choice. He had to, but he still had a bad feeling about it, and he probably should have. On the other hand, if Shady really did regret it and he was worried about it, his actions completely contradicted it. Because while Shady was still at Martin's house, another VNE gang member named Stomper came by, and it wasn't even 5 minutes after he got there that Shady started talking about the shooting that he did at Lou Costello Park. He started bragging about it, but the context that he put it in, he made it seem like he dropped an ESG gang member. He started fabricating his story. He started telling everyone that he whacked someone from ESG. So his whole thing was just getting that recognition and that street credibility. But that would end up coming back to hurt him as well. You know, I'm definitely not implying that I think it would have been justified for Shady to take Martin out, but I don't understand why he didn't go with his gut feeling and get rid of the problem when he was worried about it. This would end up being the second time that he disregarded that little voice that kept speaking to him in the back of his mind. That's called your conscience. That little voice that usually acts as the voice of reason, and that little voice that gives you guidance when you need it. So the very next day after he had this conversation with Martin, Martin ended up going to LAPD and telling the cops everything he knew about the shooting. You know, who knows what Martin's motive for going to the police really was, but who knows? Maybe Martin seen the way that Shady was bragging to Stomper 5 minutes after he got there and started thinking to himself, you know what? If this guy is willing to brag about this to this individual, then it's just a matter of time before this gets exposed. I'm just gonna go ahead and beat him to the punch and get it out now, opposed to waiting and getting wrapped up in this and end up being on the other side. I don't know, I'm speculating, but when you think about it, Martin had to have been discouraged by the way Shady started talking about it. So maybe that had something to do with it. You know, whatever the case was, whatever motivated Martin to break his silence, that's what ended up happening. So after Martin gave the homicide detectives all the details about the shooting and the murder, then Martin also identified Shady in a photo lineup. So the district attorney that would later end up prosecuting the case granted Martin full immunity in exchange for his truthful testimony. And then later at the trial, Martin testified that there was absolutely no doubt in his mind that it was Shady that fired the shot that ended up killing Manuel Palacios. But later, if that wasn't bad enough, an actual ESG gang member named Miguel Pereira, who also went by the name Flaco, would eventually come forward and tell police that on the day of the killing, that he was in Lou Costello Park himself when he seen Shady, and Shady apparently pointed his AK-47 in his direction. Apparently Flaco was part of the crowd that had gathered in the carport between the two buildings directly across the street. According to Flaco, he didn't know Manuel personally himself, but he claimed that he was being shot at when that murder occurred. So once law enforcement had all the details of the murder, they started building a case against Shady. But this was time consuming. This wasn't something that happened right away. And part of the reason for that is because their two main witnesses, Flaco and Martin, they weren't exactly considered to be credible witnesses. So therefore, they had to find another way to corroborate some of the information that they were using. However, before the homicide detectives were able to put this case together, and this would be something they would draw a lot of heat for, Shady ended up catching another body. And the circumstances behind the second murder were just as senseless and egregious as the first one. So sometime around July of 2003, approximately 8 months after Palacios was killed, Shady was looking for someone to rob when he spotted two individuals walking through the Estrada Quartz projects. An individual by the name of Christopher Marquez, who also went by the name Little Man, and his girlfriend Linda Mexicanos were walking towards Linda's mother's apartment near the park in the same territory that's claimed by VNE. Apparently, Little Man had just purchased a bicycle from someone on the street when Shady walked up and confronted him. So allegedly, Shady stepped in his line of walking, grabbed the bicycle by the bars, and asked Little Man where he was from. Little Man responded by saying Pico Nuevo, the name of the gang where he was from, in Pico Rivera. Shady, on the other hand, responded by saying, "Give me your bike, punk." When Little Man refused to let go of the bike, Shady sucker punched him and yanked the bike away. Caught off guard, Little Man fell backwards and landed on his pockets. You know, according to other people that witnessed this incident, it was obvious that Little Man didn't want no problems, either because his lady was there or because Shady was a lot bigger than him. Whatever the case was, it was obvious that Little Man didn't want no problems. Because even after Shady hit Little Man made no attempts to fight back. So apparently Shady dazed Little Man when he clipped him, because Little Man sat there the entire time that this confrontation took place. So at around the same time that all this was happening, two other VNE gang members had walked around the corner of one of the buildings, and once they seen what was happening, they told Shady that they had a gun. Shady responded by saying, "Oh good, give it to me so I can dome this fool." So the one that had the gun walked over to where Shady was standing and he handed him the gun. So later the gun was described as being a chrome snub-nose handgun, probably a 38. So after taking the gun and loading it, Shady said to no one in particular that he was gonna fucking kill this fool. And Little Man, obviously, when he seen the gun, he was scared for his life. And he told Shady, he's like, "Look, you can have whatever you want. Take whatever you want, just don't shoot me." And keep in mind, Little Man was still sitting in the same spot. He never stood up. You know, and despite the fact that this guy was cowering and begging Shady not to shoot him, not to kill him. And at one point, he even turned his back to him and put his hands over his head as if he was expecting to be shot. Shady pointed the gun at him and fired 5 times, killing this guy in cold blood in front of his girlfriend. So after shooting Little Man, Shady and the other 2 VNE gang members, they all ran off in the same direction and eventually disappeared into the darkness. As soon as they were gone, Little Man's girlfriend used her cell phone to call 911. And despite the fact that the paramedics got there within a matter of minutes, Little Man subsequently died a few minutes later from a bullet that ruptured his aorta. Needless to say, Shady was arrested a few days after Little Man was killed. Homicide detectives already had a line on him, and within a matter of hours, they found out that he was involved in Little Man's murder as well. So facing 2 homicides that were both gang related, that had all the elements to prove that both of these murders were committed for the sole purpose of benefiting and promoting a criminal street gang, a 186.22, technically, if they really wanted to, they could have pushed the death penalty. They had multiple special circumstance allegations, lying in wait, multiple murders committed for the benefit and purpose of promoting a criminal street gang were just 2 of the special circumstances that they could have pushed. But ultimately, the DA opted to file 2 consolidated counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of second-degree robbery. And of course, they threw in some complimentary 186.22 gang allegations off the top. In the end, Shady got slammed at trial and was ultimately sentenced to consecutive terms of life in prison without the possibility of parole, LWOPs, plus an additional 25 to life for the gun enhancement, and then another 10 years for the gang enhancement. You know, in closing, I'm just gonna say this. My purpose for telling you guys some of these stories is obviously to show you guys the ugly side of gangbanging, and of course to also expose some of the hypocrisies of this lifestyle. You know, I'm not on here to bash on anyone or to put anyone in a negative light. I get the stories and I convey them to you guys. And coming from this lifestyle myself, I try not to be too opinionated when I tell you guys these stories. But sometimes when you come across stories like this, I almost feel compelled to say certain things. You know, unfortunately, gangbanging is a culture. It's a way of life that some people grow into. And whether you like it or not, it's always going to be around on some level. That's just a fact. And at least history, for that matter, has taught us that much, that it's not going to change. But when you look at some of the senseless acts of violence that are committed by some people, you can't do nothing but shake your head about it, either because of a clear lack of common sense or because of the complete disregard for innocent people's lives. What I'm trying to say is this: no matter what you feel about gangbanging, whether you're for it or against it, at some point you still have to apply some common sense and some level of morality by saying, that's just doing too much, or that steps outside the lines of what's acceptable and what's not. I mean, taking out a rival that you got into it with, somebody that done something to you in the past. I mean, taking out a rival who you got into a shootout with, or someone that done something to you in the past, getting some type of retribution, is somewhat acceptable. These are acts of gangbanging that at least some people can understand and fathom on some level, because then at least it's contained within that realm of those that sign up for it. But when it spills outside those lines and it starts to affect civilians or innocent people that don't have nothing to do with that lifestyle, when you have someone recklessly shooting into a crowd of innocent people who are just out there enjoying life with their family, or when someone comes along and takes someone else out just because they want to feel the power of holding someone else's fear in the palm of their hand, I think these are acts that cross that moral line. That's not gangbanging. That's walking the line of killing people for the thrill of it, and just for the purpose of wanting to be recognized by your fellow gang members as a down-ass homeboy, somebody that's willing to drop bodies for the neighborhood. You know, even if you are someone that glorifies this lifestyle, on some level, you've got to know that there's more to life than this. You know, I think it's pretty sad for the people who still think it's cool to do shit like this, and who continue to praise those that are stupid enough to do it. Because at the end of the day, there is no winners. Whether it's because you're one of the victims that had your life cut short by someone else, or whether you were one of the ones that went to prison for doing it. You know, sooner or later in life, we all end up growing up. And eventually we end up getting to a point where we come to realize the depth and gravity of our mistakes. Unfortunately, this is one of the ugly sides of gangbanging that becomes a reality for a lot of people. They end up getting caught in the crossfire and they end up catching a stray bullet. Manuel could have been anyone's father, brother, son, or husband. Here's someone that's out there just trying to provide for his family. He comes home after going to the grocery store to get groceries for his family, and he catches a stray bullet from somebody that indiscriminately shoots into a crowd of people with an AK-47. You know, it's crazy, but it's also sad. You know, the same thing could be said about Little Man. What purpose did his murder serve? Shady didn't even take his bike or go through his pockets and take his money, so it ended up being for nothing. Or it was like I said, Shady just wanted to show out in front of his homeboys. You know, if you're young and you still have a chance to do something positive with your life, you guys don't know how lucky and fortunate you really are. You have a golden opportunity to learn from people like me, to learn from my mistakes and other people on YouTube that have similar stories from their mistakes. There's a lot of other good channels on YouTube that share their experiences or their knowledge, things that they've learned over the years because of the mistakes that they've made. And it's you guys that stand to benefit from these stories. There's so much more to life out there, but you'll never learn this for yourself unless you give yourself a chance. You know, when I was an active NF member, I ran entire prisons. I ran yards, whole yards. And for years, I thought I had really accomplished something. I thought I was able to do something that very few people have been able to do. But eventually, I realized that this didn't mean shit. Who cares about running a prison? I didn't accomplish nothing by it. I have nothing to show for it. Who gives a fuck? Who cares that I ran a prison? Who cares that I ran a prison yard? None of that has done anything for me out here in the free world. It didn't get me a better job. It didn't get me a better paying job. It didn't do shit for me. Later, when I allowed myself to get out of that mindset, I realized that the real gangsters, the real men, were the guys that were leaders out here in the free world. Guys that were CEOs, that had hundreds of people on their workforce under them. Those are the real shot callers. Because not only are they shot callers, not only are they leaders, managers of their companies, but they're also getting paid for it. Buku dollars at the same time. This shit's for the burbs. Hopefully, if my videos aren't effective in teaching you guys this, that there's either someone else on YouTube or someone else in your life that is. Because life's a precious thing to waste. And once it's gone, there is no second chances. Anyways, I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you guys like this story, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this story, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. As always, I just want to thank those of you who continue to show your unwavering support and for just continuing to tap into the channel. With that said, you guys enjoy your week and keep pushing that positivity. Until the next one, this is your boy B, and I'm gone.